Today's lesson is on solving quadratic equations by completing the square and the quadratic formula. Now, we have already solved quadratic equations by factoring, that is if the polynomial factors, and by the square root method, and that is if the quadratic can be put in the form expression squared equals 0. But clearly, not all quadratic equations can be solved using these two methods alone. So the two methods that we are going to cover today are completing the square and the quadratic formula. And these methods can solve any quadratic equation, but both of them require a little bit longer process to solve than the first two methods, the square root method and the factoring. So although these are great because they can solve any of them, they are a bit longer. Now, completing the square is also going to be used for other applications in the next class. So completing the square is important to note for future reference. So method 3. Before we actually teach you how to complete the square, I want to do a small investigation about perfect squares. So x plus 1 quantity squared means x plus 1 times itself x plus 1. I'm going to do the work over here, which gets me x squared plus 1x plus another 1x plus 1. I add those two middle ones and I'm getting 2x in the middle term. So we have x plus 1 quantity squared is equal to x squared plus 2x plus 1. So this is a little bit tedious process, and I know you already know how to do it, so I'm going to go ahead and fill in the first couple, and then you could just pause the video and write them all down. Okay, so now that we have the first four, I want to see if you guys can come up with some patterns here. So normally in a class, people start calling out answers. One thing that people usually notice is that the first term is always just x squared. Another thing that they'll notice is that the last one is the square of the number. So 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16. So this is squared of your number, okay, the number squared. And then the other thing that people might notice here is that the one in the middle, 2, 4, 6, 8, that is double, or 2 times your number. So 4 times 2 is 8, 3 times 2 is 6, 2 times 2 is 4, 1 times 2 is 2. And then we also said that this first one is always x squared. The other thing that people will notice is that on the questions, it was always x plus or minus some number quantity squared. So what I want you to do is pause your video again using these little patterns that we came up with. See if you can't get x plus 7 quantity squared and x minus 8 quantity squared by yourself. Okay, did you get x squared plus 14x plus 49 and x squared minus 16x plus 49? Notice that it still works for negatives. When I took negative 8 and I doubled it, negative 8 times 2 is negative 16. And then when you took negative 8 and you squared it, you get positive 64. Using your pattern, we can expand a binomial squared as long as the coefficient in front of the x is 1. This pattern really only works if that leading coefficient inside the binomial squared is 1. So what I want you to do now is pause the video one more time and see if you can't fill in the blanks here. And this is really what we're trying to get at. So pause your video and see if you can fill in the blanks. Alright, did you get x plus 6 quantity squared equals x squared plus 12x plus 36? And for the second one, x minus 9 quantity squared equals x squared minus 18x plus 81. How did you get those? So Most students at this point will say, well, they took this middle number right here and they divided it by 2 to get backwards. Remember we said it was double? The number was double to get the middle term? Well, if you already have the middle term, to get backwards, you would have to divide by 2. Did that work for the other one? Certainly it did. So we took the number in the middle and divided it by 2 to get the binomial squared. In order to get this last number, you took your number that you got inside the binomial squared and you squared it. So 6 squared is 36, negative 9 squared is 81. So to do these two, the rule was you would take your middle term and you would divide that middle term by 2 to get the number inside of the binomial, and then you would square to get your last one. Divide by 2 and square. Divide by 2 and square is going to be our little mantra whenever you're trying to complete the square. We will always be dividing by 2 and squaring. In the next couple of problems, you will be given the first 2 terms and you have to fill in the blanks just like we did on the last 2 problems. You'll be given the first 2 and you have to fill in the other blanks by dividing by 2 and then squaring, which is why we did this little exercise before I actually teach you how to complete the square. Now we need to talk about when to use the completing the square method. Now, this method will always work, but sometimes it gets a little bit tedious. So I would probably only use this method if I was unable to factor or use the square root method. If I can do one of those 2 methods, those are faster and quicker and easier, and I would want to use that before I use completing the square. Now, the most convenient equations to use completing the square are is if a is equal to 1 and b is even. We'll show you why that is helpful in a little bit, but we always want a to be 1 and b to be even, and then things are going to come out nice and whole. You won't have a lot of fractions in it. Next, let's talk about your steps. Step 1. From standard form, I want you to make a equal to 1 by dividing each term by a. Next, I want you to move the constant term, that's the term without any variables, or the c term, to the right side of the equation, and then I want you to add blanks to each side, and I'll show you what that means. Step 3 is I want you to complete the square by dividing the linear term by 2 and then squaring that value. So that's where the divide by 2 and square comes up. Now, put this value in both of the blanks that you made in step 2. The left side should now factor into a perfect square. And then the last thing is to solve by using the square root method, which is something you already know how to do. So steps 1, 2, and 3 will complete the square in order to make it possible to finish the equation by the square root method. So these are the steps.